I want to look with you these 10 days at the book of Ezekiel. I'll not ask you how recently you have read Ezekiel. I talked to one person this morning that's read it in the last 2 weeks, so that's exciting. But it is a book which, in many ways, is at the core of what this camp meeting is about. The core of the holiness teaching. The core of life with God. And Ezekiel is trying to get at the reasons why the people of Judah have fallen short from that, and to help them to face that and address it. But it's also dealing with how we can indeed become a part of God's people. People often say to me, when they find out that I teach the Old Testament, I just don't understand the Old Testament. Joe, I think we could cut off this cool air. I never thought I'd say that at Indian Springs, but this air-conditioned pulpit is a little too much this morning. People often say to me, I don't understand the Old Testament. And when they say that to me, I say, I'm not surprised. Suppose you were walking down the street, and there on the sidewalk in front of you is a letter, and you pick it up. It doesn't have an envelope. You look at the greeting, and it's not a name you recognize. You look at the closing, it's not a name you recognize. You sort of scan through it, and you see some things that make sense, but a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. You don't understand it. You don't know who wrote it. You don't know why it was written. You don't know the circumstances in which it was written. So it's not surprising. So when people say to me, I don't understand the Old Testament, I say to them, that's not surprising. Because unlike any other of the world's religious books, this book is written to a specific people in a specific time, in a specific place. It is not like the Hindu Rig Vedas or the Mohammedan Quran or Confucius or any of a list of others. It's not just a list of sayings that are supposedly true. It's not just a list of true statements. There's only one book in the Bible that comes close to that, and that's the book of Proverbs. And even Proverbs you won't understand correctly unless you see it in its setting, in its background. The Bible alone, of all the world's holy books, from beginning to end, is addressed to specific people in specific places in specific times. And if you don't know who those people are, and you don't know what that place is, and you don't know what those times are, it's not surprising if it doesn't make a lot of sense. And we ask ourselves, why did God do that? Why did God choose to give His revelation, His truth, in a particular historical setting and context to a particular people? Why didn't He just sort of stand back from it all and just give a lot of truths? Well, the answer is the incarnation. You say, oh my, he's gone to using these big theological words already. Yes? What's the incarnation? The incarnation is God taking on flesh. Now that didn't start with Jesus. The whole Old Testament is incarnation. It's God putting His truth into our life, into our experience, into our time, into our place. God so much wants us to understand His truth that He puts it into a specific time, a specific place, a specific people. You know, as I do, that the thing you remember most about sermons are the illustrations. You may not remember what the point was. You may not remember what the main teaching was, but the illustrations. Why is that? Because we understand things, we remember things when they're in a life context, when they're in a life setting. And that's what God has done here. He wants us to know Him. He wants us to know His truth. And so He has put it into an illustration, a huge illustration. 66 books of illustrations. God incarnating Himself in our life. You perhaps have heard the story. It's an old one with preachers, but it gets the point across. A little boy is sitting on a curb one day, and he's watching some ants. They're running in and out of the crack in the curb, and they're busy. And he looks up the street and sees that the city water department is flushing out the fire hydrants. And they've opened the hydrant just up the street. And here coming down the curb is a rushing flood. And the little boy is frantic to try to save some of those ants, and he picks them up and puts them up on the sidewalk, and they scurry right back down again. And finally the flood comes and washes them away, and the little boy sits there and he says, I guess to help them, I'd have had to become an ant to tell them what was happening. That's what Jesus Christ has done. He's become one of us. Not merely to tell us, but in fact to be the very image of God before us. Now I'm saying that didn't start with Jesus. The whole Bible is built on that principle, that God has stepped into people's lives and shown Himself in their experience so that they can recognize who He is, what He's like, what He wants with us. Now, thank God He's done that, but it just means that if we're to understand His book in its fullness, we've got to do a little background work. We've got to figure out who were those people, where did they live, what was going on. Now, that's a long introduction to what I want to do this morning. And what I want to do this morning is give you the background to Ezekiel. You folks are going to have a big step up ahead of those who are not here this morning, but come later on. Because my hope, my belief, my prayer is that because we have an understanding of what the circumstances are, we'll understand better some of the sometimes bizarre things that Ezekiel says to us. This book was written during a 20-year period between 593 B.C. and 573 B.C. 20-year period. It was written between Ezekiel's 30th and 50th years. And that's significant, and I'll talk to you about that probably tomorrow. Between Ezekiel's 30th and 50th years, he wrote these. He wrote this book in Babylon. He was in captivity in Babylon, and he wrote it not only for the exiles who were there with him, but also for the people back at home in Jerusalem, especially in the 13 years between 593 and 586. Now, what happened in 586? Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. And Ezekiel is writing back home saying, get ready, shortly you're going to join us. Now, why was he already in exile if the destruction of Jerusalem didn't occur till 586? Well, taking hostages is not new. The Babylonians came through, and I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. They came through Jerusalem in 605 and demanded that the Judean people admit that the Babylonians are the lords of the world. Nebuchadnezzar was the king at that time. And he made this triumphal journey throughout the ancient world and received the submission of nation after nation. And when he did that, he took some hostages with him. Daniel was one of those in 605. To be sure that these Judeans back home would behave, otherwise I'll do bad things to these hostages that I've got in Babylon. In 598, it happened again. And I'll say something more about that in just a moment. And again the Babylonians came, and again they took some more hostages, and Ezekiel was one of those in 598. So Ezekiel is taken off into captivity. He's a priest. If you're taken out of the Holy Land into an unholy land like Babylon, you can never, ever be a priest again. So there he is, off in captivity. But God gives him a word. The people back in Jerusalem are saying, well, those people must have really been bad people. They must have really been rotten people, and God took them off into captivity in Babylon for their sins. Ezekiel says, don't you believe it. God is finished for now with Judah and Jerusalem, and Judah and Jerusalem are going to fall. That's the first part of his message that he sends back home there. Now, what had happened to lead up to this dire situation? If you're going to understand the Old Testament prophets, you have to understand make it three world empires. The first one is the empire of Assyria. Assyria. Now, imagine a map here. Let's look at it together. Up here is Turkey. You see it there? Good, okay. And right below it is the Mediterranean Sea. And over here is the east coast of the Mediterranean. Down here in the southeast is the little country of Judah, between the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. Judah is smaller than most of the counties in Georgia. Little bitty country. And these people have been taught to believe that their God is the only God in the universe. Talk about nerve. That's nerve. Talk about exclusivism. That's exclusivism. These people weren't inclusive at all. Unless, of course, they were apostate, and then they were very inclusive. Think about that a bit. But up here in the Tigris and the Euphrates Valley, what today is Iraq, is a great empire of Assyria. Assyria is trying to control the trade of the ancient world. That's what most empires are about. They're about money in the end. They're reaching down to the south, toward the Persian Gulf, to the rich city of Babylon, to control that. Then they're reaching across to the coast of the Mediterranean to control the sea trade that's coming into the Phoenician cities, Tyre and Sidon. Then they're reaching down to Egypt. And if they get Egypt, they'll have it all. The whole rich, fertile crescent, the whole trade chain from end to end, they'll be the rulers of the world. Ever since Solomon's kingdom collapsed from within because of his sin in the 900s, Assyria has been growing and growing and growing. They're kind of like a balloon. They expand, and then they get a weak king and they contract a little bit. Then with the next expansion, they're bigger, and then they contract. And the next, they're bigger. And that's been the experience. Now, that's hard on your nerves if you're their neighbors. You think, well, this time maybe they're going to collapse. Whoops, Nope, they're getting bigger. Well, this time, whoop, bigger still. Kind of wears you out. And that's exactly what had happened from 900 on down through into the 600s. Now remember the kings of Judah. If you've got a Wesley Bible, you can look at page 479, and there's a lovely chart there. But if you don't, well, that's too bad. Remember that between 720 and 700 BC, you had the good king Hezekiah. Hezekiah had led his nation in a revival. But when Hezekiah died, around 695, he was succeeded by his son, the worst king Judah ever had. You wonder about that, don't you? He was only 12 when he came to the throne. Was Hezekiah older and didn't pay attention to his son? Was Hezekiah too busy with the Assyrian danger? We don't know. Maybe he was a perfect father. Maybe he did everything right. Perfect fathers sometimes have rotten sons. Our job is to be a trustee. Our job is to be faithful. Our job is to do the best we can and leave the outcome in the hands of our Father. But whatever the reason, Manasseh was a terrible, terrible king. Now, he was apparently a rather good king, militarily, administratively, all those areas that don't matter. But in terms of character, and I won't make any modern applications there, but in terms of character, he was a terrible king. And he led his people directly away from the revival that Hezekiah had brought. Now they're worshiping every god they can find. They're bringing idols into the temple itself to worship. All of the tragedy of apostasy, Manasseh welcomed in. And so God says, through the prophets, Judah's fate is settled. It doesn't matter what may happen in the future. Judah's fate is settled. Now we know from the book of Jonah that if there had been a true national repentance, God would have gladly changed his mind. But he says, as of now, Judah's fate is settled. Friends, I wonder if God is not saying that to America right now. As of now, America's fate is settled. I don't know that. I don't know. I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I don't know that, but I wonder. Manasseh ruled from 697 to 642. 55 years. And you say, oh God, why did you allow that? And we don't know the answer to it. But God does allow us to walk the path we have chosen. 55 years. And you can imagine, you read Jeremiah, for instance, you read Zephaniah, you feel the anguish of these men of God as they see their nation just slipping further and further and further. Manasseh was replaced by a son named Ammon. Now that tells you something. Ammon is the name of the Egyptian sun god. But for some reason, his servants rebelled against him and killed him after just 2 years. We don't know why. And the people Interestingly, you wonder if they weren't planning some sort of a military coup, but the people thought the line of David was so important that the people insisted that Ammon's infant son Josiah be made king. And Josiah was put in the care of a godly high priest. And Josiah was seized by God. And in his 16th year, he began to lead a revival. Now, it wasn't enough of a revival to bring national repentance, apparently. It wasn't enough of a revival to avert the destruction that was coming. But it was enough, I believe, to get a core of people again convinced, believing, faithful. And thus, when the end came, and that core was taken into captivity, people like in Ezekiel, they were able to believe. They were able not to be destroyed in their faith by the tragedy that was overtaking them. They were able to say, yes, God is faithful, He'll keep us. And so, unlike northern Israel, which simply disappears in captivity, there was this core of believers who, when the hour came, were ready to believe God and go home again and be the core that God could use. So if I say that Josiah's revival did not, in fact, save the nation, well, there's a sense in which it did save the nation. It didn't save it from temporal destruction. It didn't save it from going down under the Babylonians, but it did save the nation in the end, I'm sure. So God give us a revival. His revival, whatever kind of revival He can give us in this hour that we can receive. God, if that's what it's going to take, then give us that core of faithful believers who will believe no matter what. Now, I said that Assyria had been the great power that they were struggling with. But an amazing thing happened during Josiah's reign. The balloon popped. The greatest extent that Assyria ever reached, it reached about 640. They did control everything from the Persian Gulf to Egypt. They were reaching out toward the Greek coast of Turkey. They were at their absolute zenith. And within 25 years, the capital city, Nineveh, had been destroyed. The Assyrian Grand Army, which had ruled the world for 300 years, was on the run. Amazing. What had happened? Babylon, that rich city down in the south there, had gotten together with some people across the mountains in what is today Iran, the Medes, and the Babylonians and the Medes were the tool that God used. And the Judeans shouldn't have been surprised. Isaiah, 100 years earlier, had said, you're not going to fall to Assyria. It's Babylon that Judah's going to fall to. And I can imagine some people laughing. Poor old Isaiah, he's lost it. Babylon? No, they're not a world power. Yes, they're a rich city. Yes, they're a mighty commercial power, but they're not a military power. Poor old Isaiah, he's past it. Well, he wasn't past it at all. Assyria collapsed like that balloon bursting, and Babylon took the southern and the richest part of the empire. The Medes got the northern part. The Babylonians got the southern part. And so this is why in 605 Nebuchadnezzar comes through on a grand triumphant tour. He's taking over the old Assyrian territories and demanding that people submit to him now instead of the Assyrians. And so, Josiah dies tragically. We don't have time to go into all that. And Josiah was followed by no less than 3 of his sons. First of all, in the chaos of the end of the Assyrian Empire, the Egyptians were trying to help the Assyrian army. They thought a weak Assyria was better than a strong Babylon. So the Egyptians were going up the coast to try to help the remnants of the Assyrian army. Josiah tried to stop them. We don't know why he did that. The Bible tells us that the Egyptian king told him, "Don't do this. God told me to tell you not to do this." Well, I don't suppose I'd believe an Egyptian who told me what God was saying either. But for whatever reason, Josiah tried to stop the Egyptian army, and he was killed. Josiah's son Jehoahaz. Now, there's not going to be an exam on this, so you don't have to be too worried. But you ought to know this stuff. Josiah's son Jehoahaz was put on the throne. Well, the Egyptians immediately deposed him. The Babylonians hadn't won the final battle yet, so the Egyptians deposed Jehoahaz and put their choice of king on the throne, a nice fellow named Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim, another son of Josiah, ruled for 20 years, from 609 to 598. He was another bad king. The classic example is Jeremiah is the prophet now. Jeremiah writes his prophecies on a scroll and sends them to Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim is sitting in the palace. It's wintertime. He's got a charcoal fire burning there in a brazier. And as they unroll the scroll and read the column, Jehoiakim takes his pocket knife, cuts that strip off, and throws it in the fire. Now there's a real dumb guy. I can get rid of God's judgment upon me and my life and my behavior. I can deny it, I can forget it, I can destroy it. And when the word reached Jeremiah, Jeremiah said to his scribe, "Baruch, come here." And he dictated the whole thing again and added some. He can't get away from God. Jehoiakim thought he could, though. So Jehoiakim started out a vassal of the Egyptians. Well, that didn't last long. The Babylonians came through, and so Jehoiakim said, "Oh, I made a big mistake there. Sorry, Nebuchadnezzar. I'm your man. I'm for you. You're the greatest guy that ever lived." And Nebuchadnezzar, who knew the ways of the world, said, "That's nice, Jehoiakim, but I'm taking some hostages anyway." And Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were taken off as hostages. But all these little nations that are under the thumb of these big empires are always planning rebellions. I mean, that's the national occupation. We're not going to send any more taxes back to those people in Babylon. We're going to keep our money for ourselves. How do we do this? So they're always planning rebellions, and about 600, Jehoiakim got involved in a rebellion. Stopped paying tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. Stopped sending any troops to him. Well, if that's successful, rebellion is a good idea. If it's not successful, it's real painful. And it wasn't successful. Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged the city, and it was clear the city was going to fall. And very conveniently, Jehoiakim died. Now, it's interesting, the Bible doesn't tell us why he died or how he died. He just died. And his son, this is Josiah.